praises a great old hymn of the church, number 466. A mighty fortress is our God. I'd like to go to what is one of my favorite passages in the Bible, but I can probably say that most Sundays because there's so many that are good in there. But what I find is especially interesting about this passage, which I guess isn't really unique to it so much, but it really applies well to the 21st century that we are living in now. There's so much in this passage, I couldn't simply get everything that I wanted to say in one message, so we will look at it over the next week or two. And the story features the prophet Elijah. We're going to focus this morning at this man who was persecuted greatly for his faith. But this morning I specifically want to look at how God prepared him for his ministry. Just as God prepares any of his children who are willing to go out and do ministry for him, no matter where you're at. The story is found in the book of 1 Kings. At this point in the story, in Israel's history, they have kings. It's a monarchy. And when you read in the Bible, you learn that the kings keep getting worse and worse. One will die, then the next one will take over, and he does evil in the eyes of the Lord, worse than his father did. And it was a pretty bad situation. It got so bad that King Ahab, he married the pagan princess Jezebel we talked about a month or so ago. She certainly had no tolerance whatsoever for followers of God. And this morning, the translation that I will use is going to refer to the name Yahweh. Maybe you've heard that somewhere along the way. That's a name that I believe most Christians should be familiar with. It is the old Hebrew word for God. Okay, different translations may say God, some will say Yahweh. The one I'll use this morning uses that, and what we're looking at this morning is that Yahweh was working to get the attention of the Israelites so that they would come back and return to him and give him the worship that he deserves. So what God did is he told his prophet Elijah to predict a severe drought in the land. Now this drought wasn't just a few days, a few weeks, or a few months. Try 3 years without rain. So in the other corner, in one corner you have Yahweh. In the other corner you have Baal, who is the sky god. He is the main deity that Jezebel worshipped, by the way. 450 prophets were commissioned to this false god Baal, and none of them, no matter how much they prayed, could break the drought and make it rain. Well, rather ironic, isn't it, that you would think that the sky god would have no trouble making it rain. But it took him 3 years and he still couldn't accomplish that feat. So a reasonable person should have the light bulb go off in their head and they say something doesn't make sense here. Maybe Baal is not as powerful as we think he is. So the prophet spent untold hours praying to their God for rain, but because we know that Yahweh is stronger than Baal is, it exposed Baal and his prophets as frauds. Now, that's a bit of the background before we read this passage, and I just a minute ago said I'm going to use a different translation, but what may be beneficial is if you do turn in your pew Bibles in the NIV, you'll find it on page 254. And we'll be reading from 1 Kings 18 from 20 to 40. But I'm going to use a translation. It is a more recent one, but I've studied it and I feel comfortable that it is a very good and true translation called the LEB, the Lexham English Bible. If you like it and want to go to a Christian bookstore to get a copy, you won't be able to do that because it's only available online. I guess I save money that way. But it is a good translation, and if you're looking in your NIV and compare it to some of the things I'll say, there's going to be something that's probably going to jump out at you, and I'll leave that for when it happens here. But we will go to the Lord's Word and read from 1 Kings 18, verses 20 to 40. So Ahab sent word among the Israelites, and he assembled the prophets to Mount Carmel. Elijah approached to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping over two opinions? If Yahweh is God, go after him. But if Baal, go after him." But the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left a prophet of Yahweh, but the prophets of Baal are 450 men. Let them give us 2 bulls, and let them choose for themselves 1 bull, cut him in pieces, and put it on the wood. But don't let them start a fire on it. I will prepare the other bull and set it on the wood, but I will put no fire on it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh, and it shall be that the God who answers by fire, he is God." Then all the people answered and said, "The word is good." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are the majority, and call on the name of your God, but don't set fire under it." So they took the bull that he allowed to them, prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and there was no answer. So they limped about the altar which they had made. It happened at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Perhaps he is meditating, or is using the bathroom, or is on a journey. Perhaps he is asleep and must wake up." So they called out with a loud voice, and they cut themselves with swords and with spears, as was their custom, until the blood poured out all over them. It happened as noon passed, they raged until the time of the evening offering, but there was no voice, there was no answer, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near me." So all the people came closer to him. He repaired the altar of Yahweh that had been destroyed. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of God came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." With them he built an altar in the name of Yahweh, and he made a trench which would have held about 2 seahs of seed, and all around the altar. And he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and placed it on the wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." He said, "Do it again." And they did it again. He said, "Do it a 3rd time." So they did it a 3rd time. The water went all around the altar, and the trench also was filled with water. It happened at the offering of the evening oblation. Elijah the prophet went near, and he said, "O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all of these things by your words. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again." Then the fire of Yahweh fell, and it consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust. And the water which was in the trench it licked up. When all the people saw, they fell on their faces, and said, "Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God." Then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, don't let any man of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Wadi of Kishon and killed them there. And the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and the hearing of his holy word. Amen. When you read this passage, you're probably thinking, I don't ever remember when I'm reading the Bible seeing the word bathroom in there. It may not appear in your translation, it probably doesn't, but the older translations phrase it a different way. And get to that shortly, but for now, Elijah was blatantly sarcastic as we read that to prove the point to the prophets of Baal. God was ready to reveal himself to the people, so Elijah uses the sarcasm to point out what they should have seen over the last 3 years, that Yahweh is God and Baal is not, and that's the end of the story. I like Elijah a lot because I like sarcasm. Using sarcasm can be good, but it can also be bad depending on how it's used. But Elijah certainly shows his humorous side as he suggests that their God may be busy. He might be using the facilities, we'll put it that way. He's creating a contrast between this idea of Baal and the idea of Yahweh. Yahweh is never restricted by such things. He's never too busy to deal with human, the things going on here. Yahweh simply isn't limited in his abilities. But Elijah suggests strongly that Baal may be limited, and he's no more powerful than a mere man. It's quite the slander against this God, or false God as we should say. Now, just a minute or two ago I said how there's this rephrasing between the translations, and it requires a little bit of an explanation. I won't get too deep into the weeds on it, but as I said, probably your translation does not read like the LEB does. The question is, why did the LEB choose to use those words and the older ones don't? We don't find this phrasing anywhere else. Well, you have to go back to the original biblical language, and the word that is used there makes a reference to making waste. So you figure it out from there. What happened was simply the older translations, the translators chose to polish up the words a little bit. That's really all that we are talking about. They use words such as he is busy, which is true. He is occupied, some say. That's true. Some even said he is busy thinking. I guess that's true too, or can be. It was a sign of the times where people, the translators in different eras, thought that using those words just wasn't in their best interest, let's put it that way. So, according to the culture in which Elijah lived, though, what he actually was saying is what we read here. Going to the bathroom was one of the most undignified things that a person could do, so that's why he chose those words to apply to Baal. He wanted, again, to provide this contrast between him and the great God, the one and only God. Just like Elijah, we need to know the truth about our God and about other false gods as well. But it takes discernment too. What if someone asks you, is your God alive? Well, we know Muhammad is dead. We know that Buddha is dead. We know that Confucius is dead. But we know that Jesus Christ is alive. Jesus, amen, absolutely. Jesus isn't in the grave. Eyewitnesses saw that he arose bodily into heaven. We can tell anyone else, did your God do that? Mine did, because he holds the power over death and of the grave. So I rest my case.
That is correct.
Now we come to the showdown. Sacrificial showdown, as I call it in the title. Elijah got everyone's attention from the get-go, and he laid out the rules. The only thing that they weren't allowed to do was add fire to their offering. That was reserved for Baal to do, if he could do such a thing. The sacrifice and the wood, theirs was dry. They weren't instructed to put any water or anything. It should have easily caught fire if their God could even create fire. The prophets of Baal, they selected the bull, they put it on the altar, they prepared it, they did everything. Then they started their rituals. They're dancing, shouting, limping around. These are just no more than empty religious rituals. If there's any credit that we can give to these people, though, it is that they were definitely dedicated. Dedicated to the wrong thing, mind you, but dedicated nonetheless.
Correct.
Then they waited. And they waited, and waited some more. So if you have a contest, how long are you going to wait? A few minutes, certainly. Would you even wait an hour? I'm not sure. I'm reminded of back in 1981, minor league baseball game occurred. As you know, most games typically run 9 innings. Well, this game went a record 33 innings in length. Now, if I were there, I certainly would have stayed for the whole 8.5 hours because I love baseball. But I know that if I would stay for the 33 innings, I would find myself having to walk home because I know Tracy would not be waiting around for 33 innings. I think 10 innings she might go, 11 would be pushing it. But the way, see, it's just a difference in the way we look at things. I paid X amount for the ticket. I'm getting bonus baseball out of this. But it's, again, some just don't recognize a deal when they see it, I guess. After a while, though, you're going to lose interest. And well before that 8.5 hours, even before the 6 or so hours that the Israelites awaited at this sacrificial showdown. During this time, the prophets kept shouting, "Baal, answer us," and here we find what I think is one of the saddest sentences that we read in the whole Bible, or phrases maybe. No one answered. How many times do we see people pursuing all these other ways to God, and despite their best attempts, the sad result is no one answered. We looked at how Elijah approached this showdown, but beneath that is a man of great faith. In just one chapter earlier, we read that Elijah informed the king that it would not rain until God tells him, and God tells Elijah to go and flee from the king. Well, Elijah, and this is all before 1 Kings 18, he ends up at the brook Cherith during this drought, and that's where God sent the ravens, if you remember that story, to miraculously bring food and water to feed Elijah and keep him alive. Through this experience, God was ministering to his prophet, directly to him, and growing his faith. He's proving to Elijah that Elijah can depend on him. But that's not all. That's not the only thing that happened. From there, where does he go? He goes and he meets this widow at Zarephath, and that's where God instructs her to feed Elijah. During this time, she has a son. He falls ill and dies. This is where God works yet another miracle through Elijah, as Elijah prays to Yahweh for the widow's son to be revived and live. It's not a mere coincidence that this showdown in 1 Kings 18 takes place after Elijah's exploits to the brook Cherith and to Zarephath. These are two significant examples that are exactly what Elijah needed so that he could stand up for Yahweh when it counted the most. And it explains why many Christians don't see God working in their lives to begin with. Maybe it's because God is starting small with you. For Elijah, he began by feeding a starving man. Then it's about allowing God to grow your faith to a point where he can use you in more and more significant ways. Because God wants committed, faithful disciples to do his work and not cut and run whenever the going gets tough. Take Elijah, for instance. He's who we've been talking about here. Yahweh knew that Elijah's strength could not falter whenever he was backed in a corner, because Elijah spent time relying on Yahweh for survival. First, God provided for him and showed him just a little bit of what was possible if he trusted in God. When we read through this book of 1 Kings and the exploits of Elijah, we see how he increasingly relies on God more and more. We talked about earlier about how he waters down this offering, and he fills it so much He waters it down so much that it fills this trench that is dug around it to show how much water was used. That way they cannot accuse Elijah of somehow burning this offering himself in some sleight of hand kind of way. It is no doubt that Yahweh is the one that is responsible for consuming the sacrifice with fire. Elijah is so confident in God's ability that it requires much more of God than he requires of Baal. Again, Baal's sacrifice was dry. Anyone could have been able to light that. But again, Baal was false, so he couldn't do that. Herein, I think, lies one of the problems with modern Christianity. And I believe that it's one of the chief reasons why Christians don't recognize God's work is because they don't expect anything over and above the norm from God. They have him on speed dial in case they need something, get in an accident or lose a job or whatever the case may be, but otherwise they don't really want bothered with God that much. Oftentimes people approach God in prayer and they say things like, God, if you're there, God, if you're not busy, can you do this, that, and the other thing? Look at the way that Elijah prayed. O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all of these things by your words. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again. This is a great prayer because it is 100% focused on God. It is not a self-centered prayer as many prayers tend to be. Again, when people keep God on speed dial, to use that phraseology, they only call the number whenever they need something. And these kind of prayers are selfish in and of themselves, and they do not give glory to God. Now, there's nothing wrong with praying for things that we need or even want, as long as we are remembering that it needs to be in God's will first and foremost. So I just want to close with one more word on Elijah. The Lord did great things through this man, but he prepared Elijah for his task first. The time of preparation was not very exciting for Elijah, I'm sure, but even the mundane, routine nature of it will build character. If you're willing to allow God to prepare you, there's no reason to believe that he cannot do even greater things through you. Elijah certainly was not comfortable facing off against 450 of the enemy, but he held his ground because he knew his God well enough to know that he would never leave him, he would never forsake him. And you can promise that we can take that knowledge with us in any showdown that we may experience. Let us now bow our heads and go to him in prayer.
To We shall be